So let me frame the conversation next. Ken and I spend a lot of time talking about the fact that we both sit in a unique seat to watch the evolution of this current reality that we're in that started in late May. Specifically, the conversations that they're happening inside of business and corporate America. The world, not just America, changed on that day. And the first days after the incident, we compared notes that I know my clients were shocked, calling me just shocked, like, how could this happen, much less in America? And then that quickly evolved to, well, what do we say? The calls were coming in, and many of you know, I'm not in the statement writing business, but I was getting so many calls that I put out a piece that says, here are the things that must be in a statement. But that would be because that's where all the calls were coming from. The next set of questions became, well, who do we donate to? And, as a result, some very needy community-based organizations see millions throwing their way. That's much needed. And then that moved to, well, we need to have conversations about race. And we see, what some of those have turned into. Some companies are actually called dumpster fires because they're not actually happening very well. I would say to you, in the last 7 days, it's been, what will our public commitment be? So you'll see Google, Facebook, PepsiCo, Adidas, MasterCard, all made commitments around what they will do to increase Black talent inside their organizations. I personally feel that many of those are hollow as well, because they're talking about headcount, not real change and representation. And by the way, if you have 2 Black people, you can increase that by 50% and make it 3 Black people, and it still doesn't make a difference. And I think just in the last couple of days, and by the way, we've been at this a month now, companies are starting to ask the question, well, wait, like, you can write a statement, you can give away money, but like, we actually need to do something, right, Valerie? Yeah, like we actually need to do something. So today, Ken and I just wanted to have this conversation with this audience about needing to understand why what we need to do has to be different today. What we may have done pre-May 25th is not going to work post-May 25th. And that really is like, how do we have a better conversation and dialogue around race? And what do we need to understand in order to do so? So as I was looking for people to do this work with, that's why Dr. Hardy's expertise intrigued me. And last week, for those of you who have joined, I told a story about my daughter's experience with a recent incident. Well, something happened over the course of the week that I called Ken and I said, Ken, let's tell this story and let's teach through this story. So Ken's probably the only person on this call, and maybe a friend or 2 who may have joined in that heard the story, but let me tell you what happened on Friday night. So for as long as I can remember, Friday night is Chinese food night in the Rainford family. My mother-in-law loved Chinese food on Friday nights. It's the thing we do. It's not every Friday night, but at least every other Friday night. No matter where we are, we will find our favorite Chinese restaurant, and we go get Chinese food on Friday nights. It's that night that we do the Chinese food. We might do a movie with it. We might play a card game. It's a family ritual for us. And for me, it's been especially good because it's a time for our family to unwind. Like I've dealt in race conversation lately all day long. Like, I'm not doing race on a Friday night. I'm just doing some Chinese food with my family. And so we are currently at our home in Florida. And of course we have a favorite Chinese restaurant here too. And we called ahead for the Chinese food, ordered the food with the expectation that we would pop into the Chinese food restaurant and pop out with our food. It's a Friday night, it's two of us, the 4 of us, 2 of us will go get the food together. And so my daughter, my 25-year-old, drove my husband, and the thought was that he would get out of the car and go in and pick up the Chinese food. We are a mask and glove family, so everybody's got their masks on and gloves as well. Every car has a box of gloves. And my husband they drive up to the Chinese restaurant. My husband jumps out of the car. He walks into the restaurant. And as you might imagine, the counter's in the back and there are people waiting for their food. And as he walks into the restaurant, to the left, there are 3 white people standing, presumably waiting for their food, all masked people. My husband was the only gloved and masked, but they were masked. And on the right side was a white male who was sitting in a chair, presumably waiting for his food. My husband walks in, he walks past them, he goes to the counter. The food was not ready. So as he thought he'd wait a little bit, in behind him comes another white woman, masked, and a white man came in behind her, masked. So the only person who was not masked inside the restaurant was the gentleman who was sitting to the right. And the only person who had gloves on was my husband, big, tall, black guy. And when the second person started to walk into the restaurant behind my husband and the individual behind them, the gentleman who was sitting to the right in the chair immediately started talking about Democrats and liberals who were taking the mask thing too far, and people who needed to go back where they came from. I think that my husband tells me it was something to the effect of, I can't believe all these people here. I'm paying my tax money for them. You people need to go back home. And I don't know, Ken, but one black guy in a restaurant and the you people, like,
Right.
what do you think happened? Right?
Right.
So my husband turns and says, you people, who are you talking to? I'm talking to you. I pay my taxes. You can imagine where this thing went. So my husband believes that the Chinese people were probably calling the police. The police never arrived. I will tell y'all that beforehand, but the story continues. And they're going back and forth. And my husband is livid, livid, going back and forth with this guy. The guy's, standing up now, getting in his face. And my husband, food's still not ready. My husband walks out of the restaurant. My daughter sees my husband coming. Of course, he's coming with a different pace, right? She knows something wrong. Daddy, what happened? He proceeds to tell my daughter, and my daughter's response was, Daddy, we're in Florida. They shoot black people in Florida.
That's right.
Daddy, Daddy. She's trying to get him. Now, meanwhile, she hadn't parked, right? So she's like, maybe I should go and get the food. But of course, my husband now thinks, well, the food should be ready. Let me go back in the restaurant. The dude sitting in the chair, he's standing now, but he's still there. And he's still talking. He's still talking. So my husband, as he describes this, there were expletives just spewing. He goes, picks up the food. And as he's walking out, the individuals, remember there were other individuals in the restaurant, were walking out too. And as they got to the threshold of the door, one of the women said, oh, I'm so sorry. Guess what my husband did with her? Well, because I told you the story. Well, he cussed her out too. He cussed her out too. Well, Ken, I've not heard anything but this story since Friday night. When my husband came home, I knew something was wrong. He would not talk about it. He was furious. He was outside doing all sorts of stuff, but there was no card game. We could barely eat the Chinese food. My daughter, when I kept saying, what happened? I thought, what did you do to piss him off this time? Right? come outside, I'll tell you. And my daughter proceeded to say, she said, Mom, like I kept trying to tell them they shoot people in Florida. We stand your ground territory. And like he was just beside himself. And it
Mhm.
probably took a couple of days before he was able to talk about it. And
Mhm.
when he did, the only thing he could say to me was, I can't believe I lost my cool.
Mhm.
Can't believe I lost my cool. He's like,
Mhm.
I'm not supposed to lose my cool. And
Mhm.
so that's the story that I wanted to sort of tell the audience to frame today's conversation. Like there's so many layers to it.
Mhm.
And I think, I don't think that these things just happen inside of Chinese restaurants.
Right.
I don't think they just happen with police. I don't think they're always laced in anger. Oftentimes they're subtle. You know, the story I told last week about my neighbor, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I want to use the story to pick your brain and maybe help teach
Mhm.
our audience that why we need to do something different. So let's start with my husband,
Mhm.
right? Anger, rage, powerlessness, just it never goes away, right?
Mhm.
So help our audience understand. By the way, I also want to say that I think those same people who were standing, that I want to come back to,
Mhm.
the silent observers,
Mhm.
when he walked out and was livid and cussing them out, like I actually think that their perception might be only his anger, not from where
Right.
it comes.
Right.
So talk to our audience a little bit about that rage and anger and powerlessness, in the story for my husband.
Yeah, I just honestly just hearing the story again this morning, which you had, I was privileged enough to have you shared it with me earlier. Uh, I was very much aware, evoked a visceral response for me just hearing it. I heard the story before, and I think it evokes such a visceral reaction is because there's something familiar about that story for virtually all Black people. That
Mm,
maybe the content is slightly different, but there are versions of that story that just continue to play repetitively throughout our lives. And so your husband's reaction, I totally 100% completely understand. I've been in similar situations where I've reacted the same way in the moment, had the same post moment reflection, and that what doesn't show to the naked eye, what doesn't show to folks who haven't really um, teased out the dynamics of race in the society and what it means to be a Black person or any other person of color in society when your life is pushed along the margins of society. No
mm,
matter how much hard you work, no matter what you achieve, no matter how much you try to walk a straight and narrow line, it doesn't protect you from the blowback that comes from having Black skin. And so that, I'm sure um, that your husband's rage had very much to do with what he experienced that night, but it had to do with all the other experiences that he's had. And when he's saying, I I should not have let that get to me. Well, see, the rage he expressed that night was very much connected to even all the times when he didn't allow it to get to him. Because what happens is we have these experiences and that we pushed him down in the interest of the moment. Because if we took the time to lean into and combat every single time that one is hit with a microaggression or racial insult or racial insult. We spend our entire days doing that. And so we've developed a coping skill. It's kind of like that old Timex watch slogan: take a licking and keep on ticking is what we essentially do. But what happens is there is a consequence for every time we stuff something down in order to get by in that particular moment. There's another moment where there's going to be a crescendo where all that emotion comes out. And so I'm sure in that,
now.
yeah, so in that moment he's not just responding to that but all the other indignities that he had to deal with. And that is, and I'll just say this, that is also another dynamic that that is not recognizable to the naked eye, that as a Black person, we're constantly trapped in this vicious cycle of voicelessness and not speaking, and speaking with rage.
Mm.
And so those two things are connected. And so it doesn't surprise me that after the fact, he's saying that he has this remorse that somehow he let this get to him.
Yeah.
And so what it's saying to him is that maybe next time he needs to respond differently. But that's where the dilemma is, because the next time, if he responds differently where he doesn't say anything, that's only another down payment in the expression of some future expression of rage.
Mm. Mm. That deep, deep. So Ken, let's go to my daughter. Fear for her
Mm-hmm.
father, right?
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that one.
Well, see, and I often talk about race and racism as a traumatic experience. We don't treat it that way in society, but it is for anybody who's ever been on the receiving end of it. So your daughter's fear is rooted in a kind of, uh, uh, at 25 years old, there's a whole recording of race related incidents that she has inside of her. And so she's not
Including the ones
crazy.
I shared last week, right?
Exactly. So she's not crazy to be fearful that she's talking about being in Florida, being in an open carry state, that she knows that one call to the police, that from a one of those white people in that store saying they felt threatened, could be the difference between her driving her father home and driving her father to the emergency ward of the local hospital. And so fear is very much one of those emotions that we have to constantly live with. I don't have to say this to you, but I'm sure if you take a moment, take off your consultant corporate hat, that just as a Valerie the mother, I'm sure you live with fear virtually every day about your husband, about your children. So that fear is always there. We may not always metabolize it. We may not always name it, but it's there. And if I might take a moment here just to bring up COVID-19, and this is why I continue to say that there are a set of very complex reasons for why Black people's immune systems are compromised. And it's more complicated than just we don't eat the right foods. That
Mm.
when you're carrying a sense of fear and worry inside of you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for years, that the human body wasn't equipped to carry those kinds of toxins, which ultimately break down the immune system. So it just becomes another layer of complication for Black people in this society.
And it's fear and caution, right? Because like we don't let him go out on a Friday night for Chinese food by himself.
Right.
That's
Right.
not a consideration that all families have to deal with.
Right.
That this Black father who just wants to spend time with his family doing a ritual that they love, that you have to think about how he even goes to pick up the food. So fear and caution, I
Yeah.
think, go together, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
absolutely, absolutely. And like I said, that fear is embedded in an experience. It's not like if it were fear and it had no reality attached to it, we'd call it anxiety. But because
Mm.
but because it's attached to experiences that your daughter can point to very concretely, that fear is actually well founded.
Mhm.
I would actually worry about her if she was in that situation and didn't have fear.
Right,
That's a bigger worry.
right. So let's talk about the antagonist in this situation,
Mhm.
who I jokingly said to Ken, let's call him Jack for jackass, right? So Jack. So Jack had anger going on too, right? Tell us help those of us who don't understand Jack understand what was going on with Jack.
Well, and this may be slightly beyond the scope of this call, but I think it's important just for me to say very quickly. I think there's a distinction to be made between anger and rage. So I
Mm.
think your husband had rage because rage is tied into perpetual experiences of degradation when you've been devalued, when your dignity's been assaulted. That you cannot have those experiences and not have rage. You may not always express it, but it's there. Anger is a much more immediate emotion. It's much more tied into an episode. And so my understanding of Jack is, so I don't think that white people have race-related rage. They may have rage connected to the ways in which they've been degraded along class, like poor whites, for example, may have rage connected to their sense of poverty. But in this moment, I'm thinking that what Jack is expressing is anger, and this anger is also tied into a kind of fear and entitlement. The fear is that somehow he sees the world as all of us sees it. He sees that the complexion of our world is changing. And so I think there's this fear about people of color taking over. I think there's this anger about what he's entitled to. This is why I go back to where you came from. Get out of my country. That there's a sense of belongingness and a sense of entitlement that is being threatened, and that never gets analyzed. But I think that's what's operating for him. That somehow there's an entitlement that he has, which is also emblematic, I think, of why he's in the establishment without a mask, without gloves, because it's about his individual freedom, what he's entitled, that he's entitled to do this. And that's what's coming to the fore there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's do the bystanders, right? So the bystanders who didn't say anything when they could have, who I don't know, were they thinking that it didn't have anything to do with them? What do you think about the bystanders?
Well, see, I think this is why this is what, Valerie, I think is the richness of the story, because it really isn't a story about a Friday night visit to the Chinese restaurant in some city in Florida. This story is really about, it's the American story. Yeah. That this story plays over over again. Exactly. Mm-hmm. And so I think the bystanders, are just like, I think there's a difference between being silenced, which is what happens to people of color, and being quiet. Quiet is volitional. When you are silenced, it means somebody is threatening you for having a voice. So they weren't threatened. So this was volitional, that they had an opportunity to speak up and didn't. And I think that that is what allows racism and these inequities to persist, is because when well-intentioned white people see but don't say, like like my message to white people, particularly progressive whites who really have a vision for a different kind of country, a different kind of office, a different type of approach to one's corporation, is that you almost have to invoke the TSA rule. When you see something, say something. That doesn't always happen. And so what this one person wanted to say to your husband in private, oh, I'm so sorry, I completely understand his response. I have responded similarly to situations like that, because it's almost like you're in a position where you want it both ways, that you want to protect your privilege here by remaining silent, which is a privilege, and then to cut a little sidebar deal with me in a private moment over here to separate yourself from that. Well, I think the right thing to do, the just thing to do, if you're really interested in racial equity and inclusion, that you speak up when it matters most, and you speak up right on the stage where this atrocity, where this microaggression happened. And all too often, in offices throughout this country, we have the same dynamic where someone will hear something but not say anything, will experience a comment or see it and not say anything. And then in another conversation, we'll say, well, what can I do to help dismantle racism? Well, it starts there. Yeah. If you see something, you must say something.
Yeah, and I take it one step further and say, if you see something, not only must you say something, but you must do something.
Oh, well, absolutely.
And, when we talked about this last week, there's so many people inside of organization saying, I want to help. What can I read? Right? Well, that's readily available. Like, you don't need to ask anybody that question. You should say, like, what can I do? And then try to figure those things out on your own, right?
Right.
Where are the people who are not advancing in the organization, and why?
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
By the way, I said this to the leaders of an HR, global HR consultancy organization this week, right? There's so many things leaders can do that are far beyond what they're currently doing. So one example is all of us who sit inside of corporate America know that when an issue gets raised to employee relations, that typically those people are working on behalf of the organization. And most of us know at least one or two people who there have been repeated cases lodged against them or grievances for racism, but it's hard to make that stuff stick. So I said to this policy organization, number one, I would like to see organizations take those activities for ER investigations and give them to a third party. And I'd like to see them reopen every case where a person has been had a grievance against them, more than three of them, right?
Hmm.
That's what we did with Me Too.
Right.
Why can't
That's right.
we do this
Right.
for race issues? Which
Hmm.
brings me to the next question. You are so um, um, intentional about the words we use:
Hmm.
race, racism, black, white. Talk to our audience about why you think that's important.
Well, because I mean, I think that race is a reality in this world in which we live in, and it's a powerful organizing principle. I can't think of any interaction that we have in our society that isn't shaped by the nuances of race in some way, shape, or form. Thus, your story: Friday night ritual Chinese food, and race is an overlay to that story. You're on your own private time, relaxing, and yet all of, I imagine, your entire family with elevated blood pressures now because of this, what's happened with this race, this idea to go home and watch a movie, shot. And so that it permeates our society, and I get frustrated when, and so on the one hand we have this kind of crazy notion where race is powerfully significant, and then we pretend it isn't. And one of the ways in which we pretend it isn't significant, the one of the ways in which we perpetuate the denial of its significance, is either by not talking about it, or when we talk about it in such oblique, such general, sanitized ways. And so rather than saying, black people or white people, we say people of other groups or other cultures or other ethnicities. When I think that there's something about the sanitizing of that allows us to deny the significance of it. And
And
so
by the way, that is also true. The reason why I love the work that you and I do together is because we're on opposite ends of the spectrum, right? Like
Mhm.
you educate folks on why we have to do these race conversations differently, like the historical underpinnings of it. And I'm in organizations looking at the analytics, and we do the same thing there, right?
Right,
We
right,
rush across and say URMs,
right,
underrepresented minorities,
right.
right? But the devil is in the detail of
That's
looking
right.
specifically at
That's right.
Black people and Latinx people,
That's
right?
right. That's right. And that's why I have the same concerns about, I understand why it is, but I have the same concerns about when we talk about uh, uh, creating an inclusive milieu, for example, or or being inclusive. I understand the spirit of what that means, but it also means that you can be inclusive and not ever touch the issue of race.
Yes. So let's go there to that conversation. We talked about this last week, right? We both agree that the conversations of inclusion and belonging and unconscious bias training, I actually think has been part of the problem because
Hmm.
we've tried to create these amorphous, intangible words for
Hmm.
what we're all striving for.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
we won't actually talk about this subject the way that you and I are talking about it now. So
Right.
we purposely don't talk about race.
Right.
And that's the reason why I don't think unconscious bias, I think we just need to blow that up.
Right.
Your thoughts
Right.
there?
Right. Well, I do because I think the premise of it is, and particularly when I've worked with organizations, it's almost the premise is, well, we all have unconscious bias, and so it has a way, it makes it generic, uh, but I think unless we talk about unconscious racial bias, then there isn't a guarantee that we ever get to the ugliness of race and racism.
Right.
because that conversation becomes so broad and so incredibly vague that it's unclear exactly what it's designed to really attack. And so I think unless it says, my recommendation is always we're talking about unconscious racial bias, and that way we hone in on the issue of race.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about leadership inside these organizations next. And I want to get to families too. We've done a
Mm-hmm.
little work around families too. I want to come to that, but I want to start with leaders. Um, we're inside organizations having these kinds of conversations, and you and I laugh about this because the leaders themselves, the CEOs themselves, there are very, very few of them that are in the conversations themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They are providing the funding all of a sudden.
Mm-hmm.
They are making sure that it's happening inside the organizations. But we talk about the fact that if the leaders, if the CEOs, if the people at the top of the house don't do the level of self-reflection for themselves and lean into the conversation, nothing changes. Talk about that too, Ken.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think it speaks to an issue you described in your open remarks, which is I think it's possible for an organization to change its complexion without changing its culture.
Mhm.
And I think in order to change the culture, that starts at the top. I think it starts with the degree of consciousness that the leaders in the organization have about their own racial positioning. And so I think for leaders who are running organizations and corporations that are, at least what the desire is to be, to have a multiracial operation, that there's a level of racial literacy and a word I've made up, which I call racial lingual, that those leaders must be able to imbue. And that racial lingual is having the ability to talk about race in a way that is affiliative rather than polarizing. Nobody intends it to be that way, but if you haven't done your own work, that is essentially what happens. And so I believe that there is a kind of internal that the work of race is a work that is essentially inside out. I think for individuals and institutions, which means that I have to do my own work with around this issue of race before I can attempt to do anything with you at an individual level, at an institutional level. And I think this individual work that I'm talking about really refers to, that where it requires a kind of self examination, self interrogation, self reflection. And that's hard work to do because it means that I think any work that involves us holding a mirror up and looking at ourselves in a way that's critical is hard work, no matter what the context is. But I think that it's incumbent for leaders to be able to do that racially. And why is that? Because we're all embedded in a racialized context, and no disrespect to leaders of organizations, but leaders, no matter what color they are, have all been socialized racially as well. And so that whatever the dominant stories are in our society about race, that we carry some of that inside of us. If we don't take the time to look in, reflect on it, interrogate it, it lives inside of us like a tumor and just continues to be. And so I think that's important. And so when I try to engage leaders in this work, it requires more than a commitment to a 1 or 2 hour webinar. It's deep, in-depth work that has to be done.
And when you do the work to understand how you think or have not even thought about race, you can actually come out of that work and lead differently,
Oh yeah,
where you can see things differently, but then you can also do things about them without being told to, is
right,
kind of how I think about it.
right.
You gave an analogy last week about gender versus race. Can you do that again? Do you remember it? So
Yeah,
what?
well, I just think, it's been helpful to me because I think that just like race is a powerful organizing principle, so is gender. And I think that when we occupy uh, positions that are privileged in society, that that the privilege of those positions is to not see the privilege that comes along with it. So, I grew up in a family, obviously as a male, and there was a unique socialization that I received as a male, and so I saw different the way that the different rules applied to me didn't apply to my sister. Never really thought about it in terms of gender, and yet those messages became internalized, and so I think that I've had to go back to question all the socialization, the training I've had as a man, because it has been tilted in that direction. And I think the same thing happens with race. I think we get these powerful, indirect, implicit messages around race that we internalize, and that we may not ever go back to question some of those, but I think it's absolutely essential that we do.
So that we can move forward.
We can move, absolutely, absolutely.
And then, so I've seen some phenomenal CEOs step into this space when they did not know anything about it. Um, there are some people who they don't want to step into it. They're afraid of stepping into it. They're afraid of making a mistake. They're afraid of the lawsuit. And I say, you're in a better position to fight that lawsuit if you've been proactive versus just sitting, hiding your hands and being silent. And it takes leaders, I think, who hear what's happening and acknowledge that there's something there without defending it or trying to justify it and putting as, because that often happens, right? If you are, I can imagine all of the people, because it's happened to me, you're in a conversation, someone opens a conversation with you about race, and the minute you express a thought, they want to give you the counter thought, right? Black lives matter. No, all lives matter, right? Racism, anti-racism. So part of what I think leaders need to do is to listen with empathy, to understand, but also so that they can start to see some of these things on their own. And that's where some of the self-reflection, I think, is needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, like, I don't, and this is something I've shared with you before. I don't think that, I don't have much confidence in our ability to move from a society where not talking about race has been historically sanctioned. And so we all get the same message, that you don't talk about race, particularly in cross-racial company. So we may do that more when we're among members of our own tribe, but that's not the office space. And so I don't know that we can move from that position to suddenly saying, okay, let's talk about race without some preparation. I think it requires, there's an intermediate step, which means that if we're going to lean in and have these conversations, in boardrooms, in office spaces, in living rooms, that there's a kind of preparation that it requires. And so that part of that preparation means that when I'm sitting in that privileged position, that maybe I need to listen more than I lecture, if I want the conversation to move along. And so I'm always saying to, like, one of the things that white people can do in these cross-racial conversations, when it gets to a moment like that, Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, is to pause and ask oneself, what is more important to me in this moment? Is it to be right, or is it to be in this relationship? And how you answer that question dictates how you proceed. So if you and I are having a conversation about gender, and you're trying to tell me something as from your experience as a woman that I can't see because I'm blinded by my maleness, I can either choose to be right and get into a debate with you, which actually then erodes any chance of us having a meaningful relationship, or I can say, this relationship is more important to me right now than being right. So let me try to hear what Valerie's trying to say to me from her experience as a woman. I don't have to agree with it, but I want to be able to dignify the conversation and the relationship, by at least taking it in and not offering up some immediate counterpoint.
Right.
And all too often, that's what happens in these conversations.
Right. Someone I was talking to earlier today, who I actually know is on the call, reminded me of something that I think worked beautifully as well. I've seen the those relationships where the leader says, "Tell me about yourself," and the person immediately starts talking about their career because that's what's expected.
Mm-hmm.
And if the leader were to pause and say, "No, tell me more about you. Where'd you grow
Mm-hmm.
up?" Like
Mm-hmm.
that it can be a whole nother conversation where you
Absolutely.
can learn something about the individual and also actually share that you care about more than who they are beyond what's on their resume, right?
Right. That's right. That's right.
I want to go to, by the way, last time I forgot to scroll and I realized I had all of these questions. So let me go to a couple more of the questions. Patrice, who I know is out there from SCA. So Patrice's question is, as a person who would want to be an ally in these circumstances, how should we react? As a female would also have fear that supporting in a tense situation could escalate the situation and get the person we are trying to help hurt.
Mm-hmm.
Good answer. Good.
What we see, and this is a technicality because I see what I think about as a like a white ally, for example, that what it does not mean is that I'm helping the person who's being, like in this case, your husband. I'm not helping him. That's not what an ally does. What an ally does is speaks up against racism,
Mm,
which is much broader than the interaction with. If we come back to the Chinese story with your husband, because I mean he was able to hold his own. He didn't need help. He personally didn't need help. But what would have been helpful would have been for some of the white people in that store to speak up against bigotry, to speak up against racism. And so it wouldn't necessarily require getting into altercation with Jack. It would be sitting and saying, you know, as a white person, I'm really offended by what I'm hearing. And I don't support this. I don't support singling people out and saying things that are just mean spirited. I have kids. I'm trying to raise my kids to grow up to be different. And so I'm just appalled at what I'm hearing. Uh, you offer that because then that says something to your husband about where she stands, or where that person stands, rather than turning to him and saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry that this was said to you." No, I want to. What I when I'm experiencing issues like that, as far as gender is concerned, or LGBTQ issues as a straight person, I I say what I think and feel, put it out there, because I don't want to be associated with the kind of vitriol that's being expressed. And so I think that's what it requires, is just saying what you think, what you feel, what your position is.
separating yourself from the jacks of the world.
Absolutely.
Hmm. Um, how do you, Dr. Hardy, this is from Latrial, Maddox, Dr. Hardy, how do you dismantle the idea that seeing something and saying something being viewed negatively as snitching?
Well, I mean, I think that we all have to have our own sort of moral compass about this. Like we each of us has to ask the question, who is it and how is it that we want to be in this world in which we live? And so if you see something uh, that assaults or insult your sensibilities, like what happened in a Chinese restaurant, I mean, I think you speak up, that and you live with the discomfort of whatever, however someone else frames that. I mean, like you're acting in accordance with your own, the dictates of your conscience. And so if one person speaking up and advocating is another person snitching, then I guess I'm a snitch.
Yeah, I said this to you earlier in the week. I'm going to use my Harriet Tubman reference, right? You know, Harriet Tubman would not have freed as many slaves if there weren't some white people who not only turned their heads when she was coming with those slaves,
Mm-hmm,
but also opened their doors and opened their
mm-hmm,
basements,
mm-hmm,
right? And fueled the abolitionist movement, right? Like the life would be very, very different today
mm-hmm,
if everybody had stayed silent and did
mm-hmm,
nothing.
That's right.
And
That's
by
right.
the way, I said to a number of students yesterday who I think may also be on the line, like my mother and father were sharecroppers with a sixth grade education. We are not
Mm-hmm.
that far away
Mm-hmm.
from Jim Crow,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Where there was lots of people who kept their voices quiet too. So just another reason why I feel like this is a different time and we've got to do it in a different way. And you cannot sit on the sidelines and not say something and do
Yeah.
something.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Peating, thank you for joining us. I had a great conversation with a Peating this week. So what do you do about the jacks of society? If we separate ourselves from the jacks, they are still able to cause systemic harm. How do you reach them and how do you convince them to care about Black people or the other, in quotes, she says, that they are so threatened by? Is that beyond our power? It's a great question.
It is. I mean, some of it, I mean, like you've been talking, Valerie, about the importance of speaking up. And so I refer to that as about having a voice. And and so it all depends on who we're talking about. So I think for Black people, having a voice is important because I think what it does is it provides an exit for all the toxins that we otherwise hold when we don't speak up.
Mm.
And so what I ideally what I'd want to do is for us to be able to have a conversation with the jacks of the world, and to have those conversations, not where we measure the efficacy of those conversations by whether or not Jack changes his mind. That's secondary, perhaps even tertiary. What's primary is that I look Jack in the eyes and I say to him what I think and feel, and do that in a way that I know has every right to be out there in the atmosphere as the poison that he's putting out there. And that may or may not change what's in his heart. That may not change what's in his head. But what it does change is it changes me. It changes my relationship to the poison that he's spewing. And so I always say that I much prefer to have nothing change by doing something than to have nothing change by doing nothing. And so I will always want to engage the bigoted, hostile, overly aggressive, racist person in conversations because maybe the part of me that's a therapist believes that there's tremendous healing and transformative potential in dialogue. And so I think that the thing that the jacks of the world want and benefit from is when they can use a bullhorn to put their message out there and there's nothing coming back to them, that they want to be able to sort of exist in that little isolated, and yell into the tunnel that they do. So I think we have a responsibility to engage in those conversations.
This is why I love you, man. Engage with the jacks. But guess what? We have 8 minutes left, and now everybody wants to fire away all these questions. So let's try and barrel through a couple of these. So you talked about the fear and the visceral reaction of common experiences. My question is, when asked inside a company, what are the issues that you face as a Black woman in this company? How do you answer that question without worrying about the backlash?
So here's exactly what I would say. I would say to that, I would say, Valerie, I really appreciate you asking me that question, and that you're concerned about it. And the bigger part of me wants to answer you honestly and in a way that's completely uncensored. However, I've had experiences here where speaking openly and candidly about race has always come with repercussions or some underlying price. So, as much as I would love to engage in this conversation, the fear I have that's based on my experience here makes it difficult for me to engage in the conversation in a way that I really like to.
I mean, that's pretty clear.
Yeah.
Now, how they react, you would think that how they react to that would allow you to open up the conversation, but it's a great way of making it clear.
But see, can I just say something very quickly? Because, and back to your point about leadership. See, I think if a leader has done his or her work, that issue would be approached very differently. The question would be a different question. The question would start with a self-disclosure that I realize as a CEO here, it's coming to my attention, I've had some huge blind spots with regard to race. I'm now questioning decisions that we've made. I'm questioning about the kind of environment that I've helped to create here for people like you, people of color like you. And so I'm I'm at a place where I'm going back to revisit that. And I'd love to have a conversation with you and to assure you that there's no reprisal. There's no, punishment. I'm really at a place where I want to do something about this, and I need and would value feedback from someone like you who has this experience.
Awesome. That's awesome. Hear something, say something, see something, do something. My team members want to know, how do you say something to a senior level person who has exhibited microaggressive behavior?
Well, probably with caution, first of all, but again, it would be like, I think to always, if here's what you should not do. That anytime I am giving feedback and my feedback starts with a you message, that is problematic. That's an interaction that's going to go to hell.
Mm-hmm.
So always start with an I message, and to say that, I have some feedback I want to give you about my experience here, and yet I realize that I am really nervous and fearful about giving the feedback because I'm not sure how it'd be received. And so, is there any assurance that I could get from you that we could have an honest conversation about some difficult matters without punishment?
Hey, Ken, we have only a couple minutes left, and I really want to do, we have lots more questions, but we're not going to have a chance to get them. I want to come back to this families and parents thing. So you and I, for one of my clients, they came to us and said, our employees are struggling with how to deal with this conversation with their children at home. And you did a couple of phenomenal sessions for one of my clients. One day we did a lunchtime session with parents.
Mm-hmm.
And then that evening we did a session, the parents were able to bring their kids, and it was just
Mm-hmm.
phenomenal. Can you just very quickly tell our audience how to think about this conversation with their kids?
Yeah, well, I think that it's absolutely imperative that we have these conversations, and that we sometimes make the mistake of thinking that younger kids are oblivious to what's going on because they're caught up in their world, and our older kids, adolescents, are caught up in their world. But children pay attention, and their bodies metaphorically are like equipped with video recording machines that never run out of tape. So they're seeing what's going on, they're constantly recording it. And if parents don't lean in to have conversations with your children about what happens on the street of Minneapolis or what was happening down in Atlanta or other places, then we leave young children to sort of try to make sense out of that, which is clearly nonsensical for them at such a young age. And for older children to be educated by social media and their peers, which always worries me. And so I think having the conversation is important about race, starting those conversations early. And for the parents to be proactive in initiating those conversations and not wait until your child comes to you with a question, but you're going to the child initiating a conversation. For younger children, tying it into their play and where they think they're playing. But
as an example,
I'm sorry.
You talk about coloring books as an example.
Yeah, coloring books or figurines or dolls or things like that. So I think the important thing is to be able to start those conversations early. And to listen and to not get too much down in the weeds in terms of lecturing, but to be able to listen and to self-disclose, to share with your children what you're thinking and feeling about these issues of race. I think that all that's really important to do.
And you also gave both the audience in corporate America as well as our listeners last week for the tip about how to start with the I and the vulnerable there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's like the parent starting by saying, I've been sort of preoccupied with all the unrest in the streets and can't help but notice that, and in an age appropriate way the challenge. So I was curious about like what have you observed? How is that affecting you? Would be one way of doing where the parent is actually self-disclosing first before they ask the child. And then I thought the example used last week where you're watching television, you and your daughter, and then a question springs out of a shared experience you're having around watching television. So that the story you were watching was the impetus for the conversation. And then I think there are those moments where it's appropriate for the parent just to say just directly, what are you thinking about all that's going on? What do you think about the George Floyd situation? I think that's the least effective, but I think it can be effective. I think the most effective is when the parent leads with some kind of self-disclosure, because it says to the child that it's okay to talk about this and that you're taking the risk first. I think that's why that's so important.
Listen, my friends, we could do this probably every week with a different
Right,
story
right,
and a different
right,
experience, but we're not going to.
right, right.
I just, I hope that for all of you who are listening, that you took away some nugget to take back to your family, to corporate America, on how to think about this current very explosive situation we have going on around the world, inside of America. It's just a really different time and it requires a different response. And I think it starts with leadership inside corporate America, leadership inside your homes.
That's right.
Um, do not wait for somebody else to start this conversation in your orbit, right? Start it yourselves, start it with the I conversation. Do not be judgmental. And let's help our children and families and our work families get through this time.